There's a legend in my state of a woman that lived alone with her 2 children in the woods. People don't agree on what happened to the husband. Some say he died. Others say that he left her for another woman, or that he was off fighting in the war. But which war specifically is uncertain. People only seem to agree on one point. The story is old. The legend goes that one winter, a stranger came to the woman's door. He asked her for a meal and some place to stay warm for a while. Her children were sleeping, and she was sitting by the fire alone, and she was grateful for the company. He stayed for several hours talking to the woman, and as the sun began to rise, he prepared to leave. He asked her if she wanted money in return for her hospitality. She said that she certainly could use it, and he told her that if she went and dug under a certain tree in her yard, she would find money that he buried there. She went out with a shovel and started to dig, but as soon as the shovel hit the dirt, she heard what sounded like one of her children crying out in pain. So she dropped the shovel and went back inside to check her children. They were still sleeping soundly, so she continued digging outside, but every time the shovel hit the ground, she was plagued with the sound of her children crying. Forcing herself to ignore it, she dug until eventually the screams stopped, but she still had not found the promised money. Cursing the stranger, she went back into the house, and this time, it was her turn to scream. Her children had been murdered in their beds. She ran to a nearby farm looking for help, but when she encountered a farmer, he noted that not only was she covered in blood, but so was the shovel she had used to dig a hole. She was arrested and found guilty of murder, and sentenced to be hanged. Unfortunately, the rope was tied incorrectly, and when she was dropped from the platform, her head was severed from her body. The legend concludes that all this happened in an area that is now a national park, and if you go hiking in the park, be on the lookout for a woman in rags. If she approaches you and asks for money, if you have any, you hand it over to her immediately, because if you don't have any, she kills you. It was a common thing for people to bring money with them when they went into the park. I never paid much attention to the legend personally. It didn't really make any sense to me. What was the stranger's motives? Why was he testing her? She was a single woman who had 2 children, at a time when life must have been very hard, and holds money in front of her nose and then punishes her when she goes to grab for it. I'm sure there's a lesson in there somewhere, but I'm just not sure what it is. Plus, I wasn't the type to let some stupid story deter me from going anywhere. The park was huge, with trails that were miles long. It was beautiful to behold, and I loved watching the seasons change. I went hiking in there all the time, usually by myself. I enjoyed the solitude. When I first started going alone, I'll admit that I did bring money with me. But after a while, the absurdity of it began to nag at me, and I stopped. Then came the day that my beliefs and my resolve were tested. I was by myself as usual. It was quiet that day except for the splashing of trees shedding rainwater and the occasional insistent knock of a woodpecker. I was on one of the longer trails, maybe 3/4 of a way through the park, when I saw a figure on the path ahead of me. I wasn't freaked out at this point. I couldn't be the only person who liked hiking in the rain after all, but as I got closer I noticed something was a bit off. It was a woman, but the weird part was that from the distance, it looked like she was wearing a long dress. You couldn't tell what color it had been originally because it was so dirty. I immediately remembered the legend. I had 2 thoughts. 1. Someone was playing dress up, trying to scare people and get some kicks, and maybe some spare change. And 2. I was up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. If you're listening to this, it may seem like the obvious thing to do is to turn right around and run, and not give this person the opportunity to get near me. But when you find yourself in a situation like that, where you feel a twinge of fear, like you're in a scene from a horror movie, what you normally do is hold out for hope for as long as possible that nothing is out of the ordinary. Supernatural things like that don't really happen in real life, and if they do, they certainly don't happen to you. Every muscle in my body was tense, but I forced myself to keep going forward. If it was a prank, I didn't want to show that I was scared and give this asshole the satisfaction of seeing me run. And if it wasn't, I didn't really want to turn my back on whatever it was. She was holding her upper body very stiffly, looking straight ahead. She had long dark hair that was tangled and messy, and her skin was very pale, her eyes glazed over and distant. I was at the center of the path, taking slow, careful steps. It was getting very close to me now, to the point where I had to move around her so I wouldn't walk into her. That's when I realized that I could hear her talking. Not really talking, sort of muttering to herself incoherently. This is when I started to realize that I had made a terrible mistake. I began shaking and sweating. I felt the world around me shrink until it contained nothing but me and this stiff, pale creature and the few feet of path left between us.
Do you have any money?
The sound of her voice sent a chill down my spine. And this was the one time I came out here without money. My insides felt like lava, like they were going to burn right through my abdomen and spill out onto the muddy ground. I was desperately trying to think of what I should do when I heard the knock of a woodpecker again. There was a half a moment where I felt relieved, grounded by the reminder that there was another living thing nearby. But my relief evaporated immediately. It wasn't coming from a woodpecker. It was coming from her. Her lower jaw shook up and down, and her teeth rattled together to make that thumping sound. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. She moved closer towards me, stiff and awkward, dead eyes locked into mine.
Do you have any money?
She repeated, more hostile this time. One arm raised up, and a hand poised to grab. Without thinking, I sputtered out, "No, I don't have any money, but I know where some is buried." She stopped and waited. I pointed to my left, where there was, somewhere, a path that led to the highest point in the park. She turned and began to walk away, through the underbrush, still knocking her jaw and gibbering. I didn't wait. As soon as she was off the path, I fucking booked it. I didn't want to know how long I had until she figured out that I had lied. I didn't know if she would follow me, and if she did, how fast or how far. I stumbled more than once, precariously close to falling on my ass. But I'm pretty good on my feet, and I managed to get to the edge of the woods without incident. I found myself at the top of the grassy hill that levels out at the bottom, in a hayfield. A trail wrapped around the hayfield close to the stream and went up another hill to the parking lot. I was almost free. I ran so fast down the first hill I almost tripped and face-planted. I was close to the bottom when I heard it. I could hear the sounds of teeth knocking from the edge of the woods. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw what looked like a small black dog, kind of like a Pomeranian, rolling on the ground, making its way down the hill. It rolled a few feet before I realized it wasn't a dog. It was her rolling, decapitated head. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, probably faster than I ever will again. I jumped the short wooden bridge that spans upstream, and went so fast up the next hill that I doubled over, clawing at the gravel until my ankles were bloody. Anything to make me go faster. I got to my car, shaking so damn much I almost dropped the keys twice before finally getting them in the ignition. I peeled out of the lot so fast and so recklessly that I might have hit a deer and not even noticed. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to see a mass of black hair rolling towards me, but there was nothing. I got home, locked and chained my door, and went around the house making sure all the windows were closed and locked. I was afraid to look out the windows, terrified of hearing anything that even remotely sounded like teeth chattering. For several long sleepless nights, I waited. I'm still waiting. So far, nothing. And I can't really figure out why. Is she contained in the park? Was I hallucinating? Was it a prank after all? I have not been back to the park since, and I really doubt that I ever will again. I don't even drive by it anymore. I go out of my way to avoid coming even within a mile of that place, and I always make sure I have money on me, whenever I leave the house. I was plagued by insomnia throughout my adolescence. This may have stemmed from the depression that came with being a target for bullies at my school. It could have come from the video game binging I used to do to cope with said bullying. After about 6 or 7 hours in front of the screen, my corneas would seem to have completely dried up. My problems with the outside world would dissipate when I played video games. When I turned off the console, the imperception would be replaced by red-rimmed eyes reflecting back at me. Then the long dark journey back upstairs to my room, attempting to hide my late-night gaming from my parents. My partially above-ground basement, where the TV room was located, always held the promise of freedom for me, or at least whatever that was to a relatively innocent preteen. Sleepovers, staying up all night with my friends, and of course playing video games. There was an attached garage and side door, which I told myself I would eventually sneak out through to do more adult things when I got older. I had been begging my parents to let me move into the unoccupied guest room down there for years. They stubbornly refused, convinced that I wouldn't get an ounce of sleep down there, neglecting the fact that I wasn't really sleeping in the first place. However, when I turned 13, they finally caved. I enjoyed the privacy and freedom of my new space. But the more time I spent there, the more I noticed it was a dark, unsettling place. The TV room lacked a window, so when I would have to make my way to the bathroom in the middle of the night, I had to rely on the moonlight shining down the stairs through the back door, or have to stumble through the dark TV room's light switch on the opposite wall. I tended to opt for the former, and the 3-meter dash from my bedroom to the bathroom was always terrifying. I would always imagine a figure looking at me through the back window, or shambling down the moonlit staircase. Head lolled back with mouth agape, impossibly wide, exposing jagged carnivorous teeth. With no lock on my door, where was I to seek shelter if such a monstrosity was to descend those steps? The darker parts of the basement may have been scarier still. The side door, once a harbinger of rebellion, sex, and booze, instead symbolized potential robbery and invasion. Someone could easily slip through it and lurk in the pitch-black confines of the TV room. Yet, the main contributor to my increasingly sleepless nights was the tapping sounds from within my walls. They weren't always there, only once every few days or so. The tapping would start at the far end of the opposite wall, by the closet under the stairs. It would quickly be answered at the opposite wall. Then ping-pong to the other side of the room, systemic, but not rhythmic. Then it would go to the ceiling above my bed. After 3 or 4 repeats around the room, it would finally stop. The noise itself was unnerving, but the inexplicable sense of dread that accompanied it was what really got to me. All other sounds seemed to be muffled or absorbed into that tapping. No buzz of electricity, or the house creaking under its own weight. In the seconds before the tapping, every sound wave crashed to a halt, as if the room itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. With each successive tap, goose flesh would erupt on my skin, which made the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. Even after the tapping stopped, the cold feeling of unease did not dissipate. Every sound I wanted to make was too loud, and every sound I did make was an intrusion. How long could this last? Questions like this raced through my mind each night. My already abnormal sleeping schedule was becoming untenable. I told my parents about the sounds. Despite my insistence that the tapping movements could not be those of a pest or a rodent, that they were controlled, dull hits, rather than the skittering or scraping of tiny claws on drywall, my parents called an exterminator. But no squirrels or rats were found in the walls, no trace there had ever been. My complaints about the tapping noises soon became routine. They were dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination. One mid-February night, this all came to a head. I'd went to bed relatively early, too fatigued to do much of anything. As I lay looking out at the fallen snow through the room's tiny window, the feeling of unease, worse than usual, festered in my chest. It soon became a physical sensation, feeding off my unrest. The tapping started at the opposite wall. Jolting upright, I quickly turned on the switch of my bedside lamp on. My ears were ringing despite the silence, my heart pressed into my sternum. I then waited for the loud slap above my headboard, or for the room itself to cave in, anything. Birds began to sing in my backyard, yet it was still dark outside. I checked my phone for the time, praying that the first rays of sunlight would soon make themselves known. It was 3 a.m. The high, full melodies twisted into something more sinister, as the birds' chirping reached a crescendo. The ringing in my ears became a dissonant tone. The violent quaking of my door against the frame cut through. The force of the movement caused the wall to shake. Uncontrolled, rage-filled blows, like a 300-pound man was crashing into it. But whatever it was not human. My assailant would have been inside by now if it were. I had no lock on the door. I didn't have time to envision what kind of monstrosity could be on the other side. I had to act, but didn't have the time to consider what to do. I did what all terrified children do. I dashed for the overhead light switch, conveniently located next to the door. As my finger hit the ice-cold plastic switch, I realized how close I was to whatever was behind the door. Mere centimeters. I began to envision my own demise as the lights flickered on. The pounding continued for another couple of seconds. The birds were no longer chirping. However, the silence did not make me feel more comfortable. Footsteps would have cut through the stillness, but they never came. This meant to me that whatever was outside was still lurking behind the door. I put my ear to the door as softly as I could, trying to hear what was outside without being heard myself. There was nothing. After another few minutes of trembling with my feet rooted to the floor, I threw open the door and instinctively sprinted for the TV room's light. In hindsight, I see how stupid this decision could have been if someone had been on the other side. But I guess my teenager brain had accepted the potential risk and overall absurdity of the situation. With the light on, I saw nothing out of the ordinary in the room. I checked the side and back walls, peering outside. There was only the cool night air and the falling snow. My pulse slowed slightly, but my nerves remained on edge. Out of options, I went back to my room, resigned and deathly tired. I lay down in bed, but did not shut my eyes until dawn finally came. When I woke up, I walked around my yard and garage, not sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe tracks in the snow leading out from the back or side door. Maybe to get a comment from my parents about the commotion from the night before. But there was nothing. This outcome was actually more unsettling to me than finding tangible physical evidence. For the rest of the time I lived in that house, there was no more tapping on the walls. I still know now that I was cognizant and awake when the events of that night unfolded, yet I still don't know what to make of it. In 1982, when I was 21, I joined a rock band that played together for 15 years. I played guitar and sang lead vocals. My brother Quinn played bass, and our good friend Brad played the drums. As one would expect at the time, hard rock meant loud, very loud. As such, we were always trying to find a place to practice that we would not bother others. In the early summer of 1987, when I was 25, we decided that the best thing to do was to rent out a house where we could crank it up and not be a nuisance to the neighbors. I was, at the time, still living with my parents, and Brad was just coming to the end of his apartment's lease. We found a cheap house to rent that was maybe 50 years old, with its only drawback being that it had no AC. It was located in attractive homes that were all about 25 years newer, and for whatever reason, was set off by about 100 feet from the closest home in that area, and was surrounded by these huge eucalyptus trees. It was the perfect place for a rock band to practice. Brad and I and a friend of ours named Steve shortly moved in together. Just a note about the house. When you walked in, it was a very odd-looking place, mostly because of how the ceiling jutted out at odd angles in certain parts of the living room and the kitchen, and then joined together at even odder angles. It was just really weird. The windows were permanently shut, and because of the way the landlord had put up these permanent curtains, you couldn't see out, and no one could see in. The first night I slept there, I kept hearing these intermediate little scratching noises coming from inside the closet. I suppose it was probably mice, which was kind of creepy because I really hate rodents. I got some mouse traps the next day, but oddly, I never caught any mice the whole time we lived there. That first week, I had gotten home from work one afternoon and saw that Steve's car was already there. I went in and called out, "Hey Steve," but I got no answer. I walked through the living room and dining room area, and then through the kitchen back towards the bedrooms. There I saw Steve standing in the middle of the hallway, looking up at the ceiling. As I got closer, I could see that he was actually staring at the attic entry cover. I honestly don't even think that he was aware that I was even there. I asked him what he was doing. Without taking his stare off the attic cover, he said, "For some reason I feel like I want to go up in there." I jokingly said, "Yeah, have fun." I brushed past him and went to my room to get ready for practice. We finally got the band equipment and PA set up in the living room, and began practicing 4 to 5 days a week. It was unbelievably hot due to no air conditioning in this really old house, coupled with the blistering heat of the normal Sacramento summer. What is peculiar is that even though it must have been 100 degrees in the house when we practiced, a couple of our friends who would come to listen to us play both mentioned, independent of each other, that they felt cold air off in one corner where they sat. Other friends who would come listen to the band would remark how weird our house looked and how weird it felt. I never really gave it much thought, as I was super focused on getting the band in shape. On one particular Friday night, Brad was out on a date, and Steve and I were home alone. I was writing a new song, and it was coming together pretty fast. I was feeling really inspired, and when I finished writing the music, it had only taken me 20 minutes. My normal writing time for the music portion of the song generally took me an hour or two. I would always write the music fast, and then write the lyrics a day or two later, after I had taken the chance to ruminate on the music and see how it made me feel. Because I was feeling really encouraged that the music had come together so fast, I jumped right into making lyrics that night. Steve was watching TV on the other end of the room, and because I needed it to be a bit more quiet, I asked him if he wouldn't mind turning down the TV. He was kind enough to turn it off altogether. I started right in, and he just sat and listened. As I began coming up with lyrics to the song and blending them into the melody, Steve began to offer some lyrical suggestions. You have to understand, Steve was one of our biggest fans, and he made countless lyrical suggestions to me over the years. But his lyrics were always so goofy, and I just never had the heart to tell him why I never used any of his suggestions. However, on this night, it was the weirdest thing. As I was writing this new song, I would come up with a lyric, and then Steve would offer up a suggestion that would fit perfectly. This had never happened before, and it all happened so fast that we had written all the lyrics for this new song in less than 15 minutes, with perhaps 25% of the lyrical content coming from Steve. I could not believe it on a number of levels. The title I gave it was, "If I Had a Chance." The lyrics go as follows. Reflecting back in time, to the shadows of my mind, it doesn't seem that long ago, the reason nor the rhyme. Memories fade by the mist, just trying to exist. At times it's hard to know which way your life might go. If I had a chance again, if I'd only known back then, if I only had a chance, I would do it all again. At times it's best to think things through. At times your best will never do. 'Cause when you're young and so unsure, you can't tell evil from the pure. If I had a chance again. If I'd only known back then. If I only had a chance, I would do it all again. I would do it all again. Brad got home at around 1 a.m., and the minute he walked in the door, I told him, "Dude, you gotta hear this new song that I wrote while you were gone." He told me to give him a chance to change out of his date clothes, and he would be right out. I was sitting on a stool next to my amplifier when Brad came out. He pulled up another stool right next to mine, and said, "Okay, go for it." Steve was on the other end of the room watching TV again. The TV screen was the only light in the room. I reached over and turned on my amplifier, plugged in my guitar and strapped it over my shoulder. I formed an opening E minor chord on the fretboard, and when I went to pluck the low E string to start the song, the very second I touched the string with my pick, I heard an almost imperceptible voice coming from my amplifier. It whispered, "Don't touch me." It was so weird and so shocking that I kind of jerked my hand away from the fretboard. I looked at Brad to see what his reaction was. He looked at me in confusion and said, "What's wrong?" He obviously hadn't heard the voice. I told him, "My amp just said, 'Don't touch me.'" He laughed and replied, "Yeah, right." I was thinking in my head at that moment, maybe I just thought I heard it. Steve at the other end of the room was completely oblivious to what was happening. Anyway, I decided to go ahead and try to play the song again. I formed an E minor chord again. At the very instant I touched the low E string with my pick, the voice came again, a little louder and a little more forceful this time. "Don't touch me." Brad heard it this time, and he jumped off of his stool. Steve turned around and asked, "What's going on?" "His amplifier is talking," Brad shouted. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. I was just in shock, trying to process it all. All of this was happening within seconds. I was convinced that something really bad was going on. I just didn't know exactly what it was. Simultaneously, I thought to myself, I bet if I touch that string again with my pick, that voice will talk to me again. I was horrified at the thought, but I went ahead and did it anyway. This time, when I went to pluck the low E string with my pick, the pick got within a half-inch away from the string when the voice from my amplifier said in a gravelly tone, very loudly and very forcefully, "Don't touch me." I was appalled and amazed at the same time. Steve heard it this time and jumped off the couch with a terrified look on his face. At the same time, Brad ran back through the kitchen. Suddenly, I felt a very powerful and very malicious energy pressing down around me. I felt like there was a ton of bricks on my shoulders, and I couldn't move. I immediately felt like I was going to throw up. Brad came running back out of his room and shouted, "We need to say a prayer." Brad said a prayer out loud, but it changed nothing. I still felt this ominous and very dark presence trying to overwhelm me, and I was still nauseous. I was able to get my wits about me enough to run outside. Brad and Steve followed me. We stood there shocked and totally afraid. I told them that I wasn't going to go back into that house. After a few minutes of discussing what we would do, I decided to call my parents to see if we could come stay with them. All three of us went inside together, and I quickly called my parents. They asked me what was wrong, and I told them that I would explain later. The three of us drove to my parents and stayed at their house for the night. My parents told us the next day that there wasn't enough room for all three of us, and that Steve and Brad would have to find another place to stay. Steve and I went back the next day after work, while it was still light out, and got all of our stuff, and never went back. Steve moved back in with his parents, and I with mine. Brad's parents were in Oklahoma, and had no other family in Sacramento, so he had to stay at that house for another 3 weeks, by himself. He asked his girlfriend if he could stay at her parents' house for a week, until he found another place, but they said no. Brad later told me that he had nightmares almost every night while he was staying there. Just after he finally moved out, He called me one afternoon and told me about a dream that he had right before he moved out of that place. He said that in his dream, he was driving to American River College, where he was going to school at the time. He was going down a windy road beside a creek that was overgrown with a bunch of willow trees. He said it was really foggy, and he couldn't see where he was going at all. In his dream, he suddenly heard that same voice that came out of the amplifier that night.
I know you, Tony.
I had no idea what that meant, but it scared me to death. The entire experience scarred me, and ultimately led me to the realization that there are evils in this world that we cannot see, but they can see us. Around 2014, I went through a bout of depression caused by my mother being diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I became a very quiet student in high school, and I had no friends to help me through this difficult time. I began to draw graffiti and became friends with other people in that community. As I got more into the lifestyle, I became a little reckless with my own well-being. I live in New York, and almost every graffiti artist in the state knows about the old abandoned hospital, Kings Park Psychiatric Center. The place closed down in 1996 and has been rotting away ever since. Naturally, it has the reputation of being haunted. After World War II, many soldiers suffering from PTSD were dumped here. Back then, certain mental conditions were not well understood. Thus, patients were subjected to outdated practices, such as lobotomies and electroshock therapy. I've been to the asylum plenty of times without any problems. Sure, you sometimes run into bums, stoners, and other students who are there to complete their photography class, but I never experienced anything out of the ordinary. However, all of that would change the last time I was there. Myself and some friends of mine got bored one day, so we decided to visit the hospital, just to hang out and maybe throw some tags up. We snuck into the building through a hole in the chain link fence, and then proceeded through a broken window. When we got inside, everything seemed to be normal. Mind you, we weren't 100% positive that the place was completely empty, but we saw no other cars in the parking lot, and there were no sounds coming from inside. The place was as quiet as a grave. We explored all levels of the building, and nothing remarkable happened, until we decided to use our cell phones as flashlights. We needed a light source, and my phone was fully charged before the trip. We made our way down a corridor. I approached an open doorway that led into a separate room. As I did, something felt off. They say that when something terrible happens, negative energy will linger at that exact spot forever. I tried my best to shrug it off, as I was never a believer in the paranormal, and I completely denied the existence of ghosts or spirits. Plus, I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of my friends. We walked past the doorway, and a feeling of sorrow overcame us, as if all of us were suddenly attending a child's funeral. Soon, the sadness melted away, giving way to a stronger feeling, a feeling of absolute dread, as if we had encroached into dangerous territory. My phone suddenly turned off and was now completely dead, not responding to any of my frantic efforts to reboot it. My phone was pretty old at this point, and I desperately needed an upgrade, so I chalked up the strange feeling that I felt to simply paranoia, and my phone was just old and malfunctioning. When our group got about halfway to the top of the building, every other phone suddenly died out of nowhere. But strangely, nobody seemed worried about it in the slightest. We finally got to the top floor. When we set off for this trip, I had the idea of taking a picture of sitting on the roof's ledge, with my legs dangling off of it, with a freshly painted graffiti piece behind me. This is nothing new for me, as I was a big rooftopper, and I have been very comfortable exploring rooftops in New York City. But since all of our phones were dead, I was pretty bummed out. We eventually descended back down the stairs until we got to the main floor. Once we all began heading towards the exit, we heard a door behind us slam shut. Startled, we all began bolting down the hallway in the pitch-black darkness. As we ran, multiple doors slammed shut behind us. Keep in mind that we had just checked these rooms about 20 minutes prior, and nobody was there. We sprinted and jumped over fallen debris and puddles of water until we got to the room with a broken window. The room itself was very small, about 5 by 5, with a tall ceiling and a rusted heavy steel door, which was opposite the window. This room might have been used for solitary confinement back when the hospital was still in operation. We were all panicking at this point. We lined up behind the window. And of course, the chubby kid of the group was in front of me. When it was his turn, he was struggling to get out of the window, and my heart was racing. I looked back to see the last friend in line, who was directly behind me. He had a blank stare on his face. His pupils were wide, and all the color had left his skin. "What the hell is wrong with you? You look like you just shit your pants." I was cut off by the sound of the massive steel door slamming shut. I don't even remember seeing it open. I remember that in one of my previous trips here, we all tried to open this steel door, and it was impossible. The guy in front of me eventually got through the window, and it was now my turn. Me being a smaller guy, I got through with no trouble. The rest of the group already started running away from the building. I turned back to see my friend, who was still staring blankly out of the window. The expression on his face still haunts me to this day. "Hey, what are you doing? Get the fuck out of there!" My friend snapped out of his trance and then climbed through the window. We safely got back to the car. "Thanks for waiting up on us, you fucking jerks." As we drove home, most of my friends were already laughing about what happened, while me and my friend sat in the back seat in complete silence. Before that night, I never gave ghosts or the afterlife a second thought. This experience has opened my eyes. You can never truly know until it happens to you. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning both of my parents said that they had nightmares about me going missing, which is a coincidence too strange to write off. My takeaway from this experience is that you never gamble with your life for Instagram clout or online attention. And if you ever find yourself on Long Island, do not trespass into the Kings Park Psychiatric Center. There is something within its foundation, restless and wicked.
Well over a decade ago, I used to work as a security guard at the Dade City Business Center in Florida. It was essentially a cluster of various facilities in a single plaza, and it was a pretty busy place during the day. As part of the security team, we had to constantly check all the workers and trucks from the different companies that operated there as they came and went. There was 3 main positions: the check-in station, rover patrol, and the warehouse foot patrol. I have had the pleasure of working all 3 at one time or another, but I was usually assigned to foot patrol. On Friday nights from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., I had the job of checking all the doors to the warehouses located in the back of the plaza. The rover patrol couldn't cover these areas because they were inaccessible to any type of vehicle. Most of these areas were decommissioned or abandoned. So for reference, one lonesome security putz would have to walk around a neglected back alley area close to complete darkness and hope you wouldn't encounter any trouble. I was being paid minimum wage at the time, so I wasn't looking to exert myself more than I had to. Along the far end of the plaza were functioning railroad tracks, and occasionally the train horn would sound and would come tearing by, jolting everyone on security from our dreary autopilot trances and snap us back into reality. We would take turns spewing profanities at the train and making each other laugh over the radios. We would also get to talking about the creepy sightings that would occur around the tracks. Apparently, staff around the plaza would sometimes report sightings of a young girl in a white dress, walking or floating down the tracks. always in the direction of the nearby cemetery. She would never respond to anything that was shouted at her. There wasn't many security cameras around the abandoned area of the lot, where most of these sightings would take place, so to my knowledge she was never captured on film. My superiors who trained me all swore by it. Real hard-working, tough-as-nails guys with no senses of humor at all. Both the business center and Dade City itself have reputations for being associated with supernatural encounters. There's quite a bit of history to the town that you can easily look up with a simple Google search. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but just keep in mind that most history does not illustrate humanity's good nature. Now that I've set the mood, let's get into one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had working there. It was a hot summer night in July of 2007. As per usual, I was working foot patrol, 12 long, exhausting hours of walking around and checking knobs. Not much to it, to be honest, and at least all the walking was good for my figure. In my time working there, I had experienced my share of mildly bizarre occurrences. The feeling of being watched, the temperature suddenly becoming inexplicably cold. I'm sure you all know the type of thing I'm talking about. But after a while, these things become mundane, for lack of a better word, and the wow factor gets diminished. It was around midnight when my routine took me to the aluminum plant. Unlike the other warehouses, there was slightly more involved to securing this structure than just checking doors. There was various machinery left on in the back of the warehouse, and part of my responsibility was to check some of the readouts on the consoles and make sure the numbers were being displayed between a certain range. And if they weren't, I would have to make some phone calls. To get to these consoles, you had to take some metal stairs to the second floor, which led to a walkway where you could check the numbers. And right after the last console, there would be another set of stairs that you could take to exit back down. I was idly walking by each console, glancing at each display, showing no enthusiasm as I was so lost in my routine. As I got to the end of the walkway, I made to walk down the far staircase when I paused. For a split second, I got that being watched feeling, and I glanced behind me down the way I came. For me to say that there was someone standing there would be oversimplifying it. The first thing that entered my head was that someone had simply appeared there. A woman in a white nightgown was about 10 feet away from me, looking directly at me. Yes, there was some machinery running, but even moving slowly and carefully down that walkway is almost impossible without making noise. I didn't hear a single thing to indicate that there was anyone there. I stood dead still for a few heartbeats. There wasn't much light up there on the walkway. There was just the faint glow from the display screens. I could see her outline and part of her face, but the shadows casted by her hair prevented me from seeing her eyes. I had my mag light on my belt, but the idea of reaching down and grabbing it, lifting it, and turning it on seemed way too daunting in that moment. I don't recall if the woman moved closer, but I definitely felt like she was closing in on me. I was just about to say something out loud when the woman raised her left hand and grabbed the left side of her face under her hair. She tilted her head sideways slowly, and then lifted it right off her neck. This wasn't an optical illusion because of the darkness. It wasn't a trick. I saw her arm straighten, and the woman's head was lifted directly off her torso. I sprinted down the stairs and tore out of the building. I didn't scream or anything. I just ran. I kept running until I was at the complete opposite end of the plaza. It was then I finally stopped to catch my breath. I leaned against the wall in the dark and tried to process what had just happened. The entire encounter had maybe lasted about 15 seconds, and there was a part of my brain trying to dismiss it as a prank. But the harder I tried to rationalize it, the more I began to panic. Aside from me and the other security guards, no one was supposed to have access to that building this time of night. There was no way I would have gone back there again that night. I continued on with my shift, feeling extremely vulnerable, like I was being hunted. I made up some bullshit excuse about having a family emergency and left early. I think my shocked expression helped make my story more believable to my supervisors. I never told anyone about what I saw, not my closest friends or coworkers. I was worried that they would think I was delusional or lying. I eventually returned to work after a while and went back into the routine. I never saw the mysterious figure again. In 2010, the year after I left, a citrus processing plant located in the center caught fire and nearly burned to the ground. Remember how I said that the train tracks ran through the entire plaza? Well, I forgot to mention that there was no safety arm that came down when the trains would pass through at full speed. In June of 2016, a train smashed into a semi-truck that was crossing the tracks at the wrong time. I'm sure these occurrences aren't connected, but still, it makes you wonder.
There's always a reason.